Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people that can help us better understand human decision making and how we can influence it. Now, when I tell you what this episode is about, many of you may well think it's either boring or not relevant, but bear with me because what you're about to hear has implications for all of us wherever you live. My guest this time is Anu Bradford, a professor of law and international organisation at Columbia University. She's a highly sought after commentator, so I was delighted to get her onto the podcast. What Anu has specialised in is something she calls the Brussels effect, and she's just written a book about it. The Brussels effect explores how the European Union has an impact on regulation throughout the world. Now, on the face of it, particularly as I'm sat here in post-Brexit UK, that sounds a bit ridiculous. But what Anu's research highlights is that because of its size, the EU wields a huge amount of global influence. As she explains, that means that the toys that are given away in McDonald's Happy Meals in the US, and the way all of our personal data is held by large tech companies, is actually influenced by the EU. How that happens is something we explore on the podcast. It's a fascinating subject that gave me a brand new perspective, and what it illustrates is one of the key biases that drives our decision making. You wouldn't think the EU was so influential, particularly outside Europe, but as Anu explains, it really is. And once we've covered that subject, we go on to look at Anu's new area of research, the internet, and how that world can effectively be regulated. Both topics are really interesting, and no matter what your views are on Brussels or big tech, I guarantee you'll find something in here that will help you think differently about one or both of the topics. So please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Professor Anu Bradford. So Anu, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Christian, thank you. Good to be here.
And look, I want to dive straight in to talk about the Brussels effect. And I'm intrigued as to, sort of what prompted you to look at it and stimulated your interest in it.
Yeah, so the Brussels effect is my counter-narrative to this very entrenched view that many people share, that the European Union, its best days are over. It no longer matters. It is irrelevant. It is incapable of influencing the world affairs. And this narrative contradicts the kind of European Union that I discover through my teaching and research on a daily basis. I witness a lot of examples of European power, of the European Union's continuing relevance. And the Brussels effect is my attempt to then bring that narrative and correct the discourse so that we better understand what kind of power the EU has, what kind of power it doesn't have, and also what kind of power matters today.
And it's fascinating because, as you say, it goes against, so the prevalent narrative is busted flush, it's not having any impact, and it's the superpowers, it's the US, for example, that drives the global agenda.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the conversation about geopolitics and international power dynamics has been very focused on the kind of power that to me is a little bit outdated or incomplete. That if we only focus on hard power, we underestimate the kind of power that is very relevant in affecting the lives of individuals, all of us every day. So the Brussels effect talks about regulatory power, the kind of power that the EU is able to wield through its rules and regulations. And it is manifested through, for instance, the EU's regulation of data protection, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, or the EU's ability to regulate the global marketplace through competition law, or its regulation of chemicals or food safety or environmental protection. So in many ways, it captures the kind of set of regulations that affects you and me and everybody else on a daily basis. The EU laws affect the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we produce and consume. So it is the kind of power that is very tangible, that is very concrete, but it's obviously very different from the kind of power that we think about through hard power or economic sanctions or military power at its most extreme form.
And so the logic very simply is to say that because organizations are having to comply with those rules within the EU, it makes more sense for them to just do the same thing globally. So it's a sort of efficiency play. It would be because the scale of the market is big enough. So therefore, things that I'm doing for the EU market, I will just automatically do for the American market.
Exactly, Christian. So the companies generally like uniformity. They like scale economies. They like uniform branding. They don't like the idea of producing different product varieties for different markets. They don't want to deal with multiple different compliance regimes. So often in search for uniformity, these companies choose the standard that is most stringent, that allows them to produce to that standard or conform their conduct to that standard and be able to access all the markets around the world. And often it is the European Union that provides that most ambitious standard. So by complying with the EU, these companies then typically are in compliance with the regulatory frameworks across the world.
Which goes totally against the sort of regulatory arbitrage argument, which is the race to the bottom one. This is clearly a race to the top that, and as you highlight in your book, it impacts amazing amounts of things. I mean, I was particularly the story I love is the McDonald's Happy Meal, which I just think is a fabulous example of the sort of pervasiveness of this.
Yeah, so it is really, if you look at the kind of examples, the range of industries, the range of different types of companies and the markets in which you see the companies conforming to European standards. So you mentioned Happy Meals. So that is a reason of the European Chemical Regulation, REACH. And you find chemicals across so many products. So there are very few companies. If you think about textiles, if you think about paints, the automobiles, you think about toys, various appliances, all those contain chemicals. And if you are a multinational company that produces any products, you want to stay away from chemicals that would make your products unfit for the European market. So then the question is that do you really want to set up a second production line in order to take advantage of lower regulatory standards in other markets? No, once you have made the commitment and incurred the cost of bringing your products into compliance with the European Union chemical regulation, you apply those same chemicals across the global marketplace. So if you are Revlon, and you produce cosmetics and makeups, and you do not want to incorporate certain chemicals into your makeup in order to export into the EU, you do not typically produce a second variety for the American market or for the Asian market.
And that's an astonishing thing, because the prevalent narrative, as I say, is the opposite. And I might as well turn to this topic now, given where I'm based, which is the UK. Which is sort of, we want to be freed of all this European stuff. And that was one of the overriding pieces of logic behind Brexit, which was to get shot of all this stuff so that we could do what we wanted. And what you're basically depicting is the opposite, is that those standards will continue to apply. The multinationals will still apply them in theory after Brexit, because that's what they do everywhere else. Exactly,
Christian. So to me, this idea that the UK could declare economic sovereignty and unleash itself from the Brussels regulations post-Brexit, it is one of the biggest false promises of the Brexit campaign. There will not be such thing as economic sovereignty. There will not be such thing as real regulatory freedom or regulatory divergence. Because if you think about it, the importance of the European Union as the destination for the products produced in the UK or the services offered by UK companies, the EU remains a critically important market for UK companies. It is nearly half of the UK trade. And the EU is the number one export destination for many UK industries, whether we talk about aerospace or automobiles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, financial services. These companies will continue to produce products for the European markets even after leaving the European Union. And in order to do so, they need to comply with the European standards. So the question is, would they really, if you are an automobile manufacturer in the UK, do you then want to set up a second production line in order to produce to a different standard to cater your own market, which is 6 times smaller than the European market? And very few UK companies consider that to be in their economic interest. And Christian, I think what is even more interesting, perhaps, is that these UK companies might be living in an all the more regulated Europe after Brexit, because the UK has chosen to become a rule taker as opposed to rule maker. And that important voice of the UK that has often been more skeptical of regulation is no longer around the table where those regulations are being written. And there is much more space for the Franco-German type of preferences to determine the outcome of those regulations.
Right, so all the opt-outs, in essence, that the UK negotiated, either for itself that then set a tone across that sort of shifted the window, or actually negotiated across the whole of Europe, that voice is no longer there. And so the irony of what you're depicting is that the very thing that was described, which was sort of, we will no longer be shackled by, is exactly what's going to happen. And the way you depict it is even worse. I mean, that's quite an astonishing conclusion.
Yeah, and I think the intellectually honest Brits know that, even those leading the country. So if you think about some of the statements that have been made, for instance, by Information Commissioner Depham, she said that, well, Brexit doesn't really mean Brexit when it comes to data privacy. If you listen to the voice of the industry, they are demanding regulatory alignment with the EU because they know that is going to be the de facto case anyway. Their business interests will gravitate them towards the EU standards as well. So there is this discrepancy between what the government feels that it has the political commitment to, and it needs to insist that it is delivering this regulatory independence, and what the logic of the markets in the 21st century will allow the UK companies to do.
And that's absolutely fascinating. I think this is sort of, as I say, it's obvious when you put it in those terms, but it's kind of, and the other narrative that's often rolled out by people in favour of Brexit is around saying, well, look, the EU is this dominant superpower and it's setting out to do these things, and therefore the narrative would continue to say, well, this dynamic is deliberate. Is it your perspective the EU is trying to do that globally, or is it just a sort of a coincidence, just a sort of accident of scale, for want of a better phrase?
So I think it's an interesting question, Christian, because the book claims, and I think if you look at the statements of the Commission going back decades when the EU has been regulating, it is quite clear that the EU has not built its regulatory empire because it wants to rule the world. It is more an afterthought. It is an incidental byproduct. What the EU was set out to do was to build a single market. So if you look at any of these regulations, whether we talk about data protection, whether we talk about competition or environmental regulation or food safety, they normally are trying to advance 2 goals. So for instance, the protection of the environment plus the strengthening of the single market, so that we remove the barriers from trade by harmonizing some of these environmental regulations. But you see very few references to the impact of these regulations outside of the EU. So the EU was focused on these internal goals of building the single market and advancing various social and other policies embedded in these regulations. But you do see a shift. And I would trace that shift to maybe 10 years ago, when the Commission in particular starts to become much more aware of the external effect of the single market. And you start seeing references, still, of course, to the single market, still to these policy-specific goals, the consumer protection and what have you, but also to this opportunity that these regulations have to level the playing field globally, and how that the EU standard can become this gold standard globally and a template for other jurisdictions to follow. So there certainly has been a shift whereby the goal has become a much more consciously today that there is the opportunity also to shape the global marketplace. But the origins of the Brussels effect cannot be traced to a conscious desire to rule the global marketplace.
And are there any areas where that doesn't apply?
Where you mean that where the plan would have been even initially?
Yeah, so I'm looking at sort of the dominant narrative here would be that anything that they get involved in regulating, goes to that broader piece. But are there areas where they have either tried to exercise that influence, recognizing the dynamics you described, or perhaps where they haven't yet regulated that might yet be to come?
Yeah, so there's certainly areas where it's much more difficult to exercise external influence by relying on this market-based dynamic of the Brussels effect. So one example is financial regulation. So if you think about that area, it is much harder for the EU to provide the global standard because capital is mobile. If the EU regulation is too stringent, then the capital can flee. The capital can move to other places. You can list your companies outside of the EU. You can there's stock exchanges much outside of the EU that can be equally good hosts for you for your IPO. So the logic of more mobile, elastic regulatory targets will predict that the EU is less able to rely on this kind of passive power simply by regulating capital in the EU market. Those standards immediately get copied across the world. So there the EU would need to rely on different type of regulatory instruments, much more of a political conscious, whether it's diplomacy, cooperation through various international organizations or standard-setting organizations. So yes, there are limits to the Brussels effect. And I feel in many ways the main contribution of my book is to help understand where the Brussels effect is prevalent and where then the EU would indeed need to rely on more political or traditional instruments in order to exert power outside of the EU.
And where do you see the next sort of hot areas? I mean, you talked about the UK's influence disappearing. What's the next sort of pressure point that we can see where we expect to see this really manifest itself?
So I'm watching two developments in particular. If you look at the priorities of the new Commission, the digital single market will be one of them. And we are all eagerly awaiting when the Commission later this year will unveil its Digital Services Act. So I expect much more extensive regulation pertaining to the digital economy, including the extension of that regulation to artificial intelligence, where the stakes are enormous and where the regulation can impact many different industries. So that is certainly an area where the EU is seeking to assert itself, where the stakes are very high, where there's a very different narrative emerging from regulators like China, where this kind of digital authoritarianism is become an increasingly I would say, threatening competitor to the narrative that the EU would want to advance around the world. There's been a lot of demand in many markets for the authoritarian Chinese technologies, especially by authoritarian governments around the world. So the EU feels the urgency and the importance to provide another regulatory framework that advances much more of the EU's values and how we balance regulation with important protections for the individual rights and privacy and so forth. So digital economy is one. And the second is the new Green Deal. So there is an ambitious environmental agenda that this Commission seeks to advance. And I think the Brussels effect can be an important part of the solution. There are elements to the new Green Deal when we talk about carbon tariffs, for instance, that rely much more of coercive measures than the Brussels effect. But there are lots of elements where the EU can explore the extent to which it can leverage the market forces and the incentives of multinational companies to advance the environmental goals of the EU.
Wow. And if I were Donald Trump, and I were trying to, because he's as he does with many authorities and jurisdictions, has things to say about them. I mean, he's recently come out and made some comments about how awful they are, and sort of accused them of racketeering. I mean, what could he do if he wanted to defend himself against this dynamic?
So the interesting thing, Christian, is that there's very little even he can do. So President Trump can walk away from international institutions. He can walk away from the Paris Accord and say that the United States is not interested in multilateral cooperation on climate change. He can turn his back to Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade agreements, but there's very little he can do to constrain the Brussels effect, because that is not something that depends on international cooperation. The EU does not need to rely on coercion or cooperation. The EU relies on unilateralism. And if there are American companies like Facebook and Google and Microsoft that decide to follow the European General Data Protection Regulation and adopt that as the baseline for their global privacy policy, there's very little President Trump can do. The same way, even though the United States is actively rolling back various environmental protections and, for instance, chemical safety standards, if you are an American company that produces chemicals that it is exporting into the EU, you do not take advantage of the loosening of those chemical regulations because you want to be able to preserve your access to a critical export market. So in many ways, what President Trump has not realized that by, for instance, turning his back to globalization, where the US could partake in drafting some of these standards, for instance, in the trade agreement settings, he's actually trading globalization to increasing Europeanization. And I don't think that is what he actually has in mind.
No, that's certainly not what he claims to want. That's just fascinating. Yeah, I'm not sure he has grasped that the nuances there. But and look, we've managed to get to about 20 minutes without mentioning the coronavirus. But clearly, it's something that I think is pertinent to everything clearly. But how does that impact this dynamic and the EU's ability going forward?
Right. So I think it is an interesting question. And it's one of those that when writing the book, obviously, nobody would have predicted the world that we have today and the extent to which the pandemic has changed the discourse. And I think it is very relevant conversation now to ask how it transforms Europe. And it is obviously a tremendous challenge for the EU and for the rest of the world. But I would not think that the coronavirus has much of the ability to undermine the Brussels effect. And I say it for the following reason. So if we saw that the pandemic managed to bring an end to globalization, then we would see the end of the Brussels effect. The Brussels effect relies on this logic that we have multinational companies operating in the global marketplace, and they are seeking uniform regulatory frameworks. And we may see some rethinking of the supply chains, but we are not going to see a world where deglobalization would be a reality. Nations cannot declare economic sovereignty. We cannot really believe that companies worldwide would start producing, sourcing, and selling locally. We may see hedging and rethinking of how we can be more resilient and not be as exposed to, for instance, relying on Chinese raw materials, but we will not see the end of globalization. So the scale economies continue to matter, global market opportunities continue to matter, and hence the consistent regulatory frameworks will continue to matter. So in that sense, I don't think we see the end of the Brussels effect. What also will make the Brussels effect more resilient is it relies on technocratic power. And that power is not as tied to the political and economic crisis of the day, because these regulations are being drafted by the civil servants in the halls of Brussels. And these civil servants are focused on their own regulatory domain. they do not need to worry as much of some of those big political battles relating to the recovery fund, for instance. So if your task is to work on the Digital Services Act, you will come to work on the Digital Services Act. The same way that the GDPR was not sidelined by the Brexit vote. It was not sidelined by the migration crisis. So the regulatory machinery continues to hum along because the bureaucrats are keeping it going. So that's one thing. But we, at the same time, Christian, I think we may see some rethinking of regulations. So, for instance, the Digital Services Act. We now need to rethink privacy regime to some extent. So how we, for instance, may need to rely on technology to come out of the lockdowns through some way of engaging in contact tracing. And we may need to be able to deploy technology in a way that it helps us to deal with future pandemics. I don't think that means that the EU would turn its back to privacy and embrace the kind of surveillance state that would be the extreme version and allow more aggressive ways to tackle global health crisis. But there may be some rethinking of the role of privacy at in the middle of the health emergencies. So we may also see the strengthening of some elements of the EU's regulatory regime and the appetite to follow that around the world when it, for instance, comes to food safety, because we are now much more conscious of the fragility of the food supply chains and how global they are and how risky they can be. And there may be much more willingness to follow the stringent EU standards in order to preserve and protect public health.
Wow. So if anything, the effect is, you've highlighted some elements where, there may be a pivoting, but if anything, the effect is going to get larger from the picture you're painting, or looks like it'll move in that. I don't want to ask you to make predictions because I recognize that's a challenge, but it does sound as if the impact of the effect could, if anything, increase rather than decrease.
Yeah, so there's certainly a plausible argument that is the direction. And also, if you look at what has happened in the past crisis, the EU's powers tend to grow in crisis. So we normally see a move towards deeper integration as opposed to disintegration when the EU is rebuilding itself after the crisis. And I would not be surprised, and this is not a speculation or prediction, but it would not be surprising if we, for instance, saw more powers in public health to be delegated to the EU after the crisis. I think the COVID has shown us that it's very difficult to effectively fight a global pandemic if you do not have more regional and global cooperation. And one of the weaknesses of the EU's initial response can absolutely be traced to the lack of the EU's competence in public health matters. And I think very few nations would conclude that, for instance, more cooperation in the procurement of critical medical supplies, in engaging in developing the virus, in contact tracing, the coordinated response would have led to a better outcome.
The virus doesn't respect borders, and therefore you can shut them to an extent. As you were talking, it's an interesting piece where you sort of see, the as you say, the EU's influence in its own backyard and the way the EU membership looks at how it's handled this could drive a certain, and as you said, with take the UK out, greater integration of things that probably were previously unthinkable. And so we're pivoting into spaces that, that one wouldn't have previously contemplated. And that, as you say, will then have a further global knock on. I mean, that's just, it's sort of, depending on your perspective, it's either terrifying or amazing. And I guess, one of the things that when one looks at this is the understanding, and part of the reason I think the book is amazing is it exposes something that when you explain it in the way you've explained it is obvious and it makes perfect sense as a look. And yet it's massively misunderstood. And this isn't, if you ask the average person, and Brexit's a good example, but if the Happy Meal influence on the average American going out, people that have never even been to Europe, probably couldn't even point to on a map, are influenced by this piece. Why is our perception of the reality of it so far divorced from actually what's happening?
So I think, Kristen, partially, there's no denying that there have been very high-profile challenges that the EU has been grappling with. But those challenges have become the only narrative about the EU, and it has somehow overshadowed a more nuanced conversation where we have forgotten that there are these very important elements of power that have continued to grow even throughout the crisis. So somehow we were fixated on the euro crisis, we were fixated on the migration crisis. And there are serious challenges, whether we talk about the rise of populism, which is certainly not just a European problem, but a global problem, the same issue with migration and the financial crisis that is following the COVID. But Europe has certainly experienced the depth of this crisis. But somehow it has made us blind to the broader ways that the EU continues to be relevant and continues to leverage its power. And then the whole conversation about power and influence, it has been very fixated on hard power, on sort of geopolitical power, and sometimes at the expense of us also forgetting how expensive and how risky it is to leverage traditional hard power, especially today. If you think about sort of the elements of geopolitical leverage that the US can exert through its military power, the EU is obviously, there's no comparison to the military resources that the EU has compared to the US. But at the same time, if you think about the military power, it's very costly. And if you think about, for instance, the attempts to wield that power in Afghanistan and in Iraq, I think there are very few people who would question whether that was costly, and many people would question whether it was effective. So if you compare then to the nature of the power that the EU has, it's almost costless for the EU to deploy. It is very difficult for anybody to undermine. It's the global companies that basically bear the cost of complying with the EU's rules. So it is the kind of power that is more quiet, it's more passive. And partially that is why it works, Christian, because it is under the radar. It is not politicized. So that in many ways the EU has gotten away with it with very little resistance, because it is the power that is not embedded in necessarily even trade agreements or big political contested conversations. Because of its more technocratic nature. It sort of creeps into the everyday lives of individuals without a big bang where the policy is announced or the people even realize the extent to which their lives are being shaped by the decisions taken in Brussels.
Right. And I guess so the impact that is felt is within the jurisdiction. So if I look at GDPR, I lost count of how many godforsaken emails I got from various companies telling me all sorts of things. That felt tedious at the time, but that impact just sits there. For everybody else, it just appears, and it's just the way they do business, because you're not required to ask for permission. You just implement. So that's a sort of interesting thing. Whether if you like, the visibility is within the EU where changes happen, it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in the same way externally.
Yeah, but I think that GDPR is something that everybody in America have encountered. Unless you deal with the local company that really would not need to care about what the EU does, the default is that you do conform your practices and operations to the GDPR. And these days, it's not even only the standard of privacy in the EU. You see over 100 jurisdictions around the world that have adopted domestic privacy laws. And most of those laws have been crafted according to the model provided by the GDPR. And there are a few reasons for this. So, for instance, America does not have a federal privacy law. There is no template that the US could offer as an alternative for anybody to copy. So the GDPR has really tipped the market. It has become the kind of gold standard, to the extent that we even have prominent US companies that were initially quite skeptical and opposed the GDPR. They've come to embrace it. So Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, was calling for the US to adopt a GDPR type of regulation as a federal standard in the United States. So often these global companies, since they have already complied with the GDPR, and they want to have further homogeneity in their domestic markets, they become the advocates of the EU regulations in their home markets as well.
Which is astonishing, right? So you've then got, if I put my Trump hat on, that's sleeper agents who are coming back and infiltrating the homeland with something that was invented elsewhere. I mean, that's an astonishing dynamic.
It is, and it's very effective. Because at that point, you get the lobbying by your influential domestic companies that are asking for the regulatory change. It is much more effective for the Europeans to outsource that lobbying to powerful domestic constituencies. And they are the kind of companies that the decision makers need to care about. And it is one dynamic that has then led to not just a change in the global practices of companies, but also in legislations around the world. So if you look at, for instance, we talk about data privacy, but competition law is another one, where the EU-style competition rules have been replicated in many parts of the world.
I sort of like to view this positively, and I go, environment, tick, good, and I'll back all the things I think are fabulous. And I'm a big fan of personal privacy, and so there's a whole host of things that I can say good. Is there anything there that you would sort of say might be viewed as more nefarious, where this effect is unhelpful, should we say, from a and let's take a broad sort of liberal position?
Yeah, so I think it is certainly a reasonable question to be asked, whether the EU gets it right, because the stakes are very high. If EU gets it right, it gets it globally right often. If it gets it wrong, it gets it globally wrong. So I think it is the book itself, the Brussels effect, it's a description of a phenomenon that happens. I don't embrace what the EU does. I don't celebrate it, nor do I criticize it. So my main goal is to explain to people why the EU matters and how this particular type of power has been so effective in penetrating the global marketplace. But there is a chapter where I address some of the criticism that have been leveled against the Brussels effect. And one obvious is that there are many who say that regulation is costly and it leads to less innovation. And I talked to an executive at Uber, who basically asked him to describe the differences between European and American regulators. And he said that, look, what Europeans want is they want us to satisfy a consumer need. What Americans want, they want us to change the world or allow it to be changed. And obviously, if every company was innovating towards satisfying a consumer need as opposed to changing the world, some disruptive, beneficial innovations would never take place. So there's always the question of whether the EU is, in some instances, over-regulating and deterring innovation. But at the same time, I think there's a good counter-argument to be made, whereby more regulation doesn't always mean less innovation. And we have a lot of, for instance, energy-efficient technologies, whereby we are regulating more towards better environmental goals, but also spurring innovation that makes products more effective, more efficient, cheaper for the consumers. So that is also a more nuanced question. But I can't say that in every instance the level of regulation is optimal and that it should not be rethought. And a particular concern I have of the privacy regulation, for instance, that sometimes the EU regulation has had the unintended goal of being particularly burdensome for small companies. So the big tech companies have no difficulty in the end of conforming to the GDPR or following the digital copyright regulations, or if you think about the removal of hate speech from their platforms. It is the small players where the disproportionate cost is something that is a concern. And I think...
Right, which sort of perpetuates the sleeper agent thing. So part of the reason Zuckerberg will be in favor of it is it acts as a barrier to entry.
Yeah, and I think that is a concern. And that's why the EU needs to be vicious in monitoring the effects of its regulation and being nimble enough of readjusting to the extent needed. So there's certainly some questions that when we talk about distributional impact of this regulation, sometimes the costliness of the regulation, where I think there are instances where some rethinking might benefit the regulations and the welfare around the world. There's another kind of criticism that I often hear, which is this kind of resentment that the EU is a regulatory imperialist, that it's a threat to democracy around the world, where the preferences of European consumers override those of consumers in other markets. And we have, for instance, individuals in developing countries that now need to pay more for products where they could not afford to care about environmental sustainability or product safety to the same extent. So I think that's also something that it is a legitimate concern that needs to be addressed. At the same time, there are many examples of developing country governments, for instance, that are content that the EU is dedicating resources to push the companies towards better practices, safer products, when they would not have the bandwidth and the resources and the technical expertise to do so. So if the EU has stringent competition laws and it manages to dismantle global cartels, there are consumers and governments around the world that benefit when also they consumers now pay less for the products when we can get rid of global cartels. So in some instances, the EU is really providing a global public good to the benefit of not just Europeans, but consumers around the world. So, Christian, I think it is a nuanced question. It depends on where each individual stands and which particular industry or company we're looking at.
But that's fascinating, Annie, because as you were talking, the phrase that came to mind was the world's policeman, which is the label that one, if you want to go way back, you could sort of say, well, the UK kind of through its colonies sort of tried to do that, and then America kind of took that mantle. But what you've basically described here is exactly the things that, it literally is a case of where historically someone would have sent a gunboat to go and restore order or force something to happen. The same thing is just happening, but it's just being done through this total different guise. So the EU, in essence, is the world's policeman on many of these topics.
Exactly. And there are those who say that it is an example of a behavior of a regulatory imperialist, and others describe it as a behavior of a benevolent global hegemon. But in many ways, if you think about what is the EU's response, right? The EU says that all we are doing is we are regulating the single market, which we have the sovereign right to do. And it is hard to say that the EU is a regulatory imperialist if global corporations are voluntarily choosing to follow the EU standard across the global marketplace. That is not how we traditionally think about imperialism to operate. So I think it's an interesting question, but at the same time, the defense that the EU has, that ultimately we are not engaged in coercion, I think it's a strong argument for the EU.
It's fascinating if you compare it to, say, FATCA, which is unashamedly an attempt to go out and wrap your arms around something globally. These regulations, as you say, are designed for territory, and they are extraterritorial, clearly, but they're not designed with that in mind. And that's a very different piece. And that, I guess, contributes to the sort of sense of stealth around it, because it doesn't say global on the tin, and yet that's precisely what you've got inside it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but these are very fascinating and important questions when you ask that the EU is committed to keeping its agricultural products free of genetically modified organisms, GMOs. At the same time, you have African farmers that are very dependent on the export market opportunities in the EU. So they cannot afford to utilize the GMOs because they need to preserve the access to the European market. And at the same time, there is an argument to be made that they would need to deploy GMOs in order to feed their own populations. But would you then say to the EU that you do not have the right to demand GMO-free products to be served to European consumers if that's what the European consumers want? So I think it is an interesting conversation, but somewhere one where the EU has gone on to defend its own sovereign right to make decisions about its market, which can be traced to very deeply felt consumer preferences when it comes to issues like GMOs, when it comes to environmental sustainability. And yes, they do not always those preferences are not always shared among all the consumers around the world. And they may not even be fully shared by every single European consumer. But they do have a democratic foundation if you look at the preferences of European citizens and how those laws have been written in the EU to satisfy the kind of preferences that the European voters and consumers have communicated when they have voted their politicians who ultimately are then making decisions about these regulations in Europe.
If we sort of look forward, where does your research take you next? I mean, clearly there are lots of developments in the EU and things that are changing there, but what's your next sort of focal point and any key trigger points coming up that might shift this dynamic?
So I am now mainly focusing on digital economy. So I think even post-COVID, it is just obvious how important the digital economy is and how many different industries and policy areas it touches. So I am now working on my next book, which will then look into the regulatory philosophy of the European Union when it comes to regulating the different policy areas that pertain to the digital economy. So hence, I brought up quite a few times the Digital Services Act, but it's also one of those in the spirit of the Brussels effect, where the markets are really global and where whatever the EU has very deep consequences, both in terms of the economic impact, the political impact, the sociological and cultural impact in how we interact and engage with one another. So the digital economy is now the area that I'm most interested in, but at the same time, there's no shortage of fascinating topics about the EU and its broader role in this environment marked by trade wars and technology wars and the increasingly complicated relationship that the EU needs to navigate when you think about the political world around it.
As you talk about digital world, I mean, it occurs to me there's two sort of potential strands. On the one hand, you say, well, clearly it's a global thing where borders don't exist in the same way, and data centers and the cloud and all of those dynamics mean that you're not pinning it down to a single physical location. So on the one hand, you would say very clearly that the Brussels effect is likely to be exacerbated by these pieces. You could make a counter argument that says actually digital allows you to bespoke and provide sort of customization in a way that the physical world doesn't. So if I'm producing a physical good, that's expensive to retool my factory for. It's less expensive to retool my digital proposition. And therefore, actually, I could start to bifurcate the world and have sort of regulatory a balkanized approach within my digital construct. And therefore, it's easier for me to countermand this particular piece. Is there a sense of which way that this is going on that? Is that a valid analysis?
I think it's very valid. And I think it's one of the core tensions that we are facing, where the companies do need to make decisions, for instance, whether they stay out of Chinese market, just because they do not agree to the demands of the Chinese governments when it comes to censorship, for instance. Google has had to decide whether they want to have a China-specific search engine that operates according to the different rules. And it is fascinating to unpack how different companies think about the regulatory risk and how do they think about whether they start balkanizing the internet and having different policies in different marketplaces. But at the same time, we see examples of where something that might be technologically possible is not consistent with the business models. So if we think about, for instance, why do we see Facebook follow the European standard of hate speech globally when it decides what kind of speech it takes down? So one of the challenges for Facebook is that it wants there to be one Facebook. It wants there to be one conversation whereby people across different jurisdictions can participate in the same conversation. And it becomes very complicated if you start displaying different parts of the conversation to some people in the conversation, whereas other people in the conversation don't see that text. So that is no longer one Facebook. That is no longer one global conversation. So to me, it is one of my the greatest and interesting research questions right now is try to understand how the companies go about conforming their business models and thinking about the compatibility of their business model to an increasingly demanding and complicated global regulatory environment.
That's really interesting. Wow. Yeah, I must. It's when you pointed out, that's obvious. It's sort of. I was thinking more in terms of, I don't know, if you have financial services products, you can bifurcate, but clearly, as you point out, anything that has a social dynamic. Again, people tend not to restrict themselves to national borders when you think about digital communications. This being a prime example. That's fascinating stuff. So when will that book appear? Because that's a intriguing space.
Yeah, so I think it may be 2 more years before it's out in the world. But it's one of those that I think there's no shortage of interest in people having those conversations and wonderful work being done on this topic. And it's certainly something that I think, again, it touches the lives of all of us. And that's the kind of set of questions that I'm interested in tackling as a researcher, something that really shapes the way we interact with one another on a daily basis, and something that is obviously of theoretical interest, but really just has a massive, pragmatic, and policy-relevant payoff, where the governments and companies and individuals are encountering and struggling with these decisions on a daily basis. And I think it's just a tremendous opportunity as a researcher and as a scholar to try to bring some narratives and intellectual and analytical frameworks for those conversations.
Right. Yeah. And is there any sense that, given it's obviously a global business and set of products, is there any sense that, the sort of the counterweight to the sort of Brussels effect would be sort of, if you can't beat them, join them? Is there a sense that one might have one way to exert influence was to sort of say to Brussels, well, look, why don't we all do this together? And therefore you could have people joining that in a way that you wouldn't do for physical products necessarily, but you could do for digital. Is there a sense that could happen, or?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And the EU is, even though the Brussels effect is a story about EU's unilateralism, the EU, I would describe the EU as a contingent unilateralism. It is in the EU's DNA to be a multilateralist, to cooperate with regulators around the world. And often the EU has gone it alone when multilateralism has been unsatisfying and dysfunctional. And today, if you look at the state of globalization and international institutions, the regulatory cooperation internationally is difficult. And the EU has often been forced to lead alone. In the absence of the kind of like-minded partner, it hasn't been able to rely on the cooperation of the United States. It has not been able to rely on cooperation with partners like China, except in some individual instances. But the EU remains very open to it. And if you look at also partnering and not just with governments, but also with corporations around the world, and have the kind of public-private partnerships that I often think has been a preferred and the only feasible way to provide regulatory frameworks that work. So if you think about, for instance, content moderation, and the regulation of whether it's disinformation, whether it's terrorist content online, whether it is hate speech online, there is no way that you could have public authorities monitor the kind of speech that's taking place on Twitter. You need to be able to deploy technologies, AI, to be able to detect and take down that speech. It's just something that is not feasible, for instance, ex ante, for the commission to review your tweet before you... not happening. But at the same time, there is skepticism of the extent to which we can just outsource this to these companies and rely on them acting and moderating that content in public interest. And so in many ways, it does require a partnership, which is why the EU has very much relied on private voluntary code of conducts. So these companies sign these principles according to which they agree to operate. And then that framework operates in the shadow of these companies knowing that more forceful regulation is forthcoming if they do not act according to the principles that they have agreed upon together with the Commission. But I think it's a massive challenge for regulators, and we're still trying to find the right balance between how much do you really give this leeway to these companies to make the decisions, and how can that discretion, if you like, be aligned with the values by the regulators.
Right, and because it's fascinating when you the clash between the tech world of sort of disrupt and break things and quickly, and the sort of more traditional regulatory piece. And you saw in the banking industry that regulators were struggling to keep up with the way derivatives and digital trading was shifting. And that's even tougher in that space, where it's particularly if your business model intentionally sets out to disrupt things and to operate in a contrarian manner, to be able to expect those people to self-police is one hell of an ask, particularly where actually one doesn't necessarily know what the societal impact. So you don't even know what you're trying to police in some cases.
Exactly. So I think we are dealing with the dual problem of just the speed, the dynamic nature of these industries. So just the speed of change in the business models and in this whole regulatory sphere, but also then just the scale, just the amount of information, the number of tweets, the number of searches that are made online, the extent of the engagement, and also the increasingly we go back to this global nature of the user base. So if you think about what would be, you have a community, and we talk about community standards of the Facebook. It is a very heterogeneous community today. And there's not a sort of single set of values that all the users would subscribe to. So if you think about the community cannot really self-police. And if you think about the headquarters in Silicon Valley then trying to make decisions that have some kind of global legitimacy, it's also very questionable. The same way that it is questionable whether the bureaucrats in Brussels know what the global definition of acceptable speech ought to be. So I think it is a tremendous challenge for anybody to claim that it is easy to come up with a framework that is acceptable. And at the same time, I think few would say that the kind of techno-libertarianism where regulators have no say would be sustainable, that the freedom of the internet is an ungoverned internet is not very appealing in many circles anymore. So I think it's a fascinating, evolving, where we continue to look for the right balance, and whatever balance we might find today may be already outdated then next year. So it is a very dynamic process and needs to remain one.
Wow. So part of me is overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge, and part of me is kind of intrigued by the intricacies of it. Final question for you: Are you positive on this stuff, or do you see this as? I mean, are there ways we can get over this based on what you're seeing, or is it really like we're stepping into territory that, as humans, we're not necessarily, there isn't an obvious solution, and we're going to have to work something out?
So I think any regulator trying to tackle this should be quite humbled and also anxious and sort of aware of the magnitude of the challenge. Exactly the same way that any of the tech leaders on the business side should understand that this is the bigger than what they were ever prepared for. But at the same time, I think the magnitude of the challenge should not prevent us from trying to pursue the optimal regulation. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What we need to do is we need to be very transparent, at least so that it allows for a critical conversation that evaluates of whether we are getting it right, where we are getting it wrong, and that we know how these decisions are being made. What is guiding these companies' decision, for instance, what kind of speech they take down? What is the policy, so that you as a user know the standards and the regulatory frameworks that govern your engagement online. So I think that transparency and healthy self-reflection is the key starting point, especially when we understand how difficult it is for anybody to get it right. So whether I'm optimistic, I certainly think that we need to put tremendous resources and talk to the best minds and be very open to critically evaluating any regulatory decision that we make.
Fabulous. What a great note we said. Listen, thank you so much for one, enlightening me, but just with the basic principle of the Brussels effect. But secondly, some of the latter pieces that we've also talked about. Absolutely fascinating stuff. So hugely appreciated. I will put links to the Brussels effect and to your webpage in the show notes so people can find you and follow you that way, because I think you're going to find quite a few more interesting things that will be of fascinating them. So thank you for that, and thank you for spending time on the podcast. I mean, hugely appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian. It was fun. Thanks.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Anu for joining me, and of course to you for listening. If you want to find out more about the Brussels effect, there are links to Anu's book and research in the show notes. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, please do subscribe. You'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you have time to leave a review on whichever platform you're using, that's really helpful. It allows other people to find the show and for me to continue to attract high quality guests. That is it for this episode. Thank you again for joining me. Another one of these coming very soon, wherever you found this. But in the meantime, please stay safe. And thanks for listening.